It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed unusual. A quiet street, a familiar neighborhood, life unfolding as it always did. But what began as an ordinary day would unravel into one of the most chilling true stories you'll ever hear. A story so haunting, so layered with betrayal, heartbreak, and mystery that no movie could ever truly capture its weight. This isn't fiction. This isn't a script from Hollywood. It's a story of real people, real lives, and a shocking descent into darkness that left an entire community stunned. On the surface, it looked like the kind of life everyone dreamed of. A happy marriage, 3 children, a peaceful home in suburban America. But beneath that picture-perfect exterior, something far more sinister was brewing.
Welcome to Matter of Time, your destination for real, unique, and eye-opening stories. From hidden truths to fascinating events, we bring you content that informs, inspires, and keeps you hooked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because every story is better when we experience it together.
Choices made in whispers, secrets buried in the shadows, and a tragedy that would end in betrayal so deep, even the most seasoned investigators struggled to believe it. This is the story of Keith and Darlene, a story about how love can curdle into something unrecognizable, about how ambition, pressure, and desire can collide in the most destructive way imaginable, and about how sometimes the most terrifying stories don't come from books or movies. They come from behind the closed doors of our neighbors' homes. Let's begin. Keith Morrison wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to make headlines. He grew up in a middle-class family, quiet, disciplined, and determined to build a stable future. Friends described him as focused, almost rigid, the kind of man who always had a plan. He studied hard, earned his degree, and quickly moved into a promising career in finance. By his late 20s, Keith had what many would call the American dream: a stable job, a good reputation, and the ambition to climb even higher. Then there was Darlene. If Keith was all about structure, Darlene was about charm. She was vibrant, outgoing, and magnetic, the kind of person who could light up a room simply by walking into it. She grew up in a modest household too, but she carried with her a hunger for more excitement, more freedom, more adventure. She wasn't content with ordinary. She wanted a life that felt larger than the one she was given. When Keith and Darlene met, it was like 2 very different worlds colliding. He was steady. She was spontaneous. He offered security. She offered thrill. And in the beginning, that contrast was intoxicating. Friends recalled how Darlene would laugh at Keith's seriousness, while Keith adored the way Darlene pulled him out of his rigid routine. Soon the 2 married. From the outside, it seemed like a match made in heaven. Keith had the career, Darlene had the charm, and together they were building the kind of suburban fairy tale so many admired. A beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, 3 healthy children, family photos that could have been lifted straight out of a magazine. But those who looked closely began to notice the cracks. Keith's drive for success meant long hours at the office, endless late nights with spreadsheets and clients. Darlene, on the other hand, found herself restless. The life she had once dreamed of, marriage, kids, stability, suddenly felt suffocating. She missed the spark, the thrill, the attention she had been used to before. And in those cracks, darkness began to seep in. A darkness that would grow with time until it consumed everything they had built. At first, the cracks in Keith and Darlene's marriage were easy to ignore. Keith threw himself into his work, convinced that his long hours were for the good of his family. Every late night, every missed dinner, every exhausted weekend, he believed it was a sacrifice that would one day pay off. A bigger house, a better future, more opportunities for their children. But Darlene didn't see it that way. To her, Keith's endless work wasn't a sacrifice. It was abandonment. Night after night, she sat alone in a quiet house after tucking the children into bed, wondering where the man she married had gone. She missed the laughter, the warmth, the excitement. What she had once admired in Keith, his discipline and focus, now felt like cold detachment. And so, Darlene began looking elsewhere. It started innocently enough: conversations with friends, late-night phone calls, a drink after work that turned into two. But soon those conversations grew into something more: an affair, a secret double life she carefully hid from Keith. In her private moments, she told herself she deserved it, that after years of neglect, she had earned a little happiness of her own. And the man she found, charming, attentive, passionate, was everything Keith no longer seemed to be. With him, she felt alive again, desired, seen. But every secret has a cost, and soon the lies began to stack up. Late-night errands that stretched past midnight, phone calls answered in hushed tones, smiles that seemed a little too forced when Keith asked where she had been. Keith wasn't blind. He noticed the changes, the distance in Darlene's eyes, the sudden coldness in her voice, the way she seemed distracted at family dinners, her smile lingering on some invisible thought. At first, he brushed it aside, telling himself it was stress or exhaustion or just the natural weight of raising a family. But as the months passed, his suspicions hardened into dread. Something was wrong, something he couldn't quite name but could feel in his bones. And then came the arguments. Small at first, about bills, about childcare, about who was pulling more weight in the marriage. But soon they grew sharper, louder, more venomous. Words became weapons. Silence became a battlefield. Behind closed doors, the perfect family was unraveling. And neither Keith nor Darlene realized how far the unraveling would go, or how deadly it would become. By the time their marriage reached its 7th year, the Gentry home was no longer filled with laughter. It was filled with whispers, suspicion, and silence that cut sharper than any argument. Keith was tired of trying to fix what felt unfixable, tired of coming home from work to cold shoulders and half-hearted smiles. And deep down, he was beginning to suspect what he dreaded most, that Darlene wasn't just unhappy, she was unfaithful. Friends noticed the tension. Neighbors whispered that things weren't the same in the Gentry household. But no one could have imagined just how far the fracture had spread. One evening, Keith confronted Darlene. He had found messages, little fragments of conversations that didn't fit, late-night phone calls that went unanswered, receipts from places she swore she hadn't been. He didn't scream, he didn't throw anything. That wasn't his way. Instead, he asked her one quiet, devastating question. "Is there someone else?" Darlene froze. For a split second, her mask slipped. Then, with a calmness that chilled Keith to the core, she denied everything, but her eyes gave her away. And Keith knew. From that moment, their home was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. Every word exchanged was heavy with unspoken accusations. Every silence stretched longer, colder. Darlene, for her part, felt trapped. She didn't want a divorce, not because she still loved Keith, but because she feared what it would mean. Divorce would ruin her reputation. It would complicate her finances. It would take away the comfortable life she believed she deserved. And then, a thought began to creep into her mind, a thought darker than anything she had ever allowed herself to imagine. What if the only way out wasn't divorce at all? What if the only way out was Keith himself gone? It was just a passing idea at first, a whisper she tried to push away. But the more she thought about it, the more it began to take root. And soon that whisper grew louder. Keith, meanwhile, clung to hope. He believed that maybe, somehow, they could fix things for the sake of the children, if nothing else. He scaled back his hours at work, tried to spend more time at home, even agreed to counseling. But no matter what he did, Darlene was already gone. Her heart belonged elsewhere, and her mind was moving toward a decision that would change everything forever. The breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, it would come with blood. It was the night of November 8th, 2005. Outside, Robinson, Texas, slept under a blanket of stillness. But inside the Gentry home, something far darker was unfolding. Keith was exhausted. He had worked late and returned to a house heavy with tension. Darlene, distant as always, went through the motions of dinner. The children tucked into bed with their usual routines. On the surface, it was an ordinary evening, but just beneath, the air felt charged, like the moments before a storm. At 8:30 p.m., Darlene told Keith she was stepping out with friends. He didn't argue. He didn't even ask where she was going. He had learned that pushing her only led to more fights. She returned later that night, carrying with her not just the faint smell of perfume and alcohol, but an anger that simmered just below her calm exterior. A simple receipt, a piece of paper Keith found in her purse, ignited another argument, another dinner, another night shattered by finances, distrust, and the quiet decay of their marriage. For Keith, it was frustration. For Darlene, it was something else entirely. Opportunity. Hours passed. By midnight, the house had gone quiet. The children were asleep in their shared room, their soft breathing the only sound in the darkness. Keith lay in the master bedroom, restless but unaware of what was about to happen. Sometime between the late hours of night and the early hours of dawn, Darlene made her move. She slipped quietly through the house, her footsteps soundless against the floor. In her hands she carried a .22 caliber revolver, Keith's own gun, a weapon she had easy access to. She stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a long moment. The faint glow of moonlight filtered through the blinds, casting shadows across Keith's face. He was asleep, defenseless, unaware that the woman he trusted most in the world was standing over him with murder in her heart. And then it happened. One shot rang out, a single crack that shattered the silence. Keith's body jerked violently as the bullet entered his head. He gasped for breath, pink foam bubbling at his lips. He was alive, but barely. Instead of rushing to help, instead of using her training as a nurse to try and save him, Darlene did nothing. She left him there, dying in their bed, while she carefully staged the scene. The gun cabinet was opened. Some firearms were removed. The back door was propped open, as if someone had forced their way inside. She stacked a few guns outside the home, neatly placed, as if a burglar had suddenly changed his mind and fled. Every detail was planned to shift suspicion away from her. Hours later, as dawn began to break, Darlene made the call. At 6:11 a.m., she dialed 911, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "My husband, he's been shot. There's blood everywhere. Please hurry." On the other end of the line, the dispatcher heard the panic, the urgency, but to trained ears, something felt strange, too calm, too rehearsed. When paramedics arrived, Keith was still alive, but only just. The pink foam at his mouth told them everything. The damage was too severe. There would be no coming back. As they rushed him to Hillcrest Baptist Medical Center in Waco, Darlene stayed behind with the children, her role as a terrified wife firmly in place. She cried, she paced, she told officers about the open door and the missing guns. But for detectives, the story didn't quite add up. And soon they would uncover the chilling truth. From the moment detectives entered the Gentry home, the scene felt off. The back door was open, yes. Guns were missing, yes. But the details didn't fit the chaos of a real break-in. Instead of being scattered, several firearms were stacked neatly outside, as though someone wanted them to be found. Then came the timeline. Darlene insisted she had stayed with the children all night, only discovering Keith around 6 a.m. But forensic evidence told another story. The pooling of blood, the angle of the shot, even the condition of Keith's body, all pointed to an earlier attack, an attack she should have heard. Her behavior raised even more suspicion. Darlene was a nurse, trained to respond in emergencies, yet she hadn't touched Keith. No CPR, no effort to check his pulse. She simply waited for paramedics, claiming she was too afraid. And then came the 911 call. It should have been frantic, broken by panic. But it wasn't. Her words were detailed, carefully constructed, like someone giving an explanation, not a cry for help. Investigators were beginning to see through the mask, and behind it was a chilling possibility. The intruder Darlene described never existed. The killer was already inside the house.